Hello everyone, welcome here today. It's really exciting to be here and have you all here. We might just give it one more minute. I know participants are still joining. We're here today to talk about new positive narratives on small-scale fisheries. We've got a great lineup of speakers for you today. It's exciting to see everyone coming in. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. So today we're all here. It's World Oceans Day. It's a really exciting day, an important day for us to reflect on some key topics. So I'm Kate Bevitt. I'm a communication specialist with World Fish, and I'll be moderating the session today. A couple of reminders for everyone. Please place your questions in the Q&A box, and then any comments you have in the chat. I'll have some colleagues monitoring those, and we'll be sharing some information via those channels. So we have a fabulous lineup of speakers today coming from all across the world and bringing a lot of diverse experience and really deep insights and important knowledge to this topic about new positive narratives. Just a quick rundown of our session today. I've got 3 speakers here, but unfortunately one of them couldn't make it. However, we will have Nadine talking about lifting up positive narratives, and also Dihia Belhabib talking about minding one's privilege. So some really exciting topics to look forward to. Then we'll have a panel with 4 great speakers there talking on some topics about how we can all contribute to new positive narratives. Now, when we look in the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries, there's actually a whole section, a whole chapter on communication and information and research. And it really emphasises the importance of communication and information, which is necessary for effective decision-making. And so really this is an important moment for us to take stock of how we communicate. We need to make sure it's ethical and responsible and inclusive to ensure that we're living up to the true spirit of the guidelines. And the power to communicate about small-scale fisheries really carries a serious responsibility, and we have to wield that responsibility with great care. And that's because words and actions and voices at different scales, be it at global right through to local scales, can have first-hand and real impacts on women, men, and communities that depend on small-scale fisheries. So we do have to be really responsible and ethical in the way that we communicate, and really support and contribute to new positive narratives, so that we are contributing to the dignity of the sector and having positive impacts and living up to those principles and the spirit of the small-scale fisheries guidelines. So that's what we're here today to talk about, and I'm so glad you're here. And really as a resource to help us all on this journey to ensure ethical inclusive communication, I'm working with some small-scale fisheries representatives and colleagues on a how-to guide that will come out later this year. And it's intended to be a really simple and practical tool that we can all use in our daily lives and our work. And what it will contain are some key messages around small-scale fisheries, those positive narratives that we all need to rally behind, and those good communication practices. And right throughout the guide, we're intending to include some positive examples that we can all look to and learn from. And so I just want to use this moment now to ask for anyone who has suggestions to please contact me, because we'd love to include a really diverse range of examples. And it doesn't have to be one type of communication. Communication stretches right through from informal to formal and so many different mediums and channels. So I'd love to hear your thoughts if anyone would care to share those with us. So I want to take this moment now just to do a quick poll just to see who's in the room. So if you look in the chat box, my colleague will be sharing a link. If you could all just click on that, we'll just do a quick poll. And then after that, we'll dive straight into our first presentation, which will be by Nadine. So I'll just give everyone a minute to look at that poll, and then we'll share the results shortly. So these are the live results that are coming in. It's nice to see we've got some from Africa and South America, Europe and Asia, North America. It's lovely to have that full diversity of people joining us today. Even if people join late, they can still complete this poll, and we'll be able to see those later. And then in terms of the organisations represented here today, mostly from research institutes, which isn't a surprise. It's always nice to know who's in the room. All right. Thanks for that, everyone. Now we might just head into our presentations, and our first presenter will be Nadine Nemhart. She's the General Secretary of the World Forum of Fisher Peoples and also an Administrative Officer at the Caribbean Network of Fisher Folk Organisations. And she'll be speaking with us today about lifting up positive narratives about small-scale fisheries. Thank you, Nadine.
No, thank you, Kate. And in their survey, we noticed that there is a visible absence of fisherfolk organizations and social movements on the call at this moment, but I'm sure there are viewers otherwise, perhaps on YouTube or maybe on the website, where this information will be placed so that the information can be carried forward, especially to the membership of WFFP. But why I highlighted that, I just wanted to note the fact that in a global movement such as the World Forum of Fisher Peoples, where we represent a large number of movements and grassroots organizations, we have to translate information not only in English. So for example, we had persons who wanted to participate, and we have people from Russia, people in their natural local language in maybe India, Sri Lanka, and all over the world. So that is one of the reasons, especially for the WFFP, where we came to decided that all these sessions being only in English, it affected how we could participate. But nevertheless, I was so happy that Kate was invited to the WFFP, and I'm here. I'm here in the capacity of the General Secretary of the World Forum of Fisher People, and I'm very pleased to make a very short, hopefully sweet presentation, Kate. So let me see if I can do this presentation mode. It's not a big presentation. We are speaking about the new positive narratives of small-scale fisheries, and we're here celebrating World Ocean Day. As said, my name is Nadine Nemhart, and I live and I work in Belize, Central America. So I just wanted to go back and give you a few points about the WFFP for persons who are not familiar with this organization and this movement. It has been in existence since 1997. Founding members were from Delhi, India, and that part of the world. So we are about 23 years old, I would say. And it was founded on Small-Scale Fisher People Organization from the Global South. And we represent over 10 million small-scale fisher, including, of course, our indigenous people from coastal and inland regions. And we cover about 54 countries, and we definitely have presence and membership from all continents. And with our allies and our partners, I know WFF, Edith is here. We joined hand, and we were instrumental in advocating for the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries in the context of food security and poverty eradication. So that was a big win in 2014 for us small-scale fishers and organizations. So we're looking at positive narratives. I just want to give you some examples of the work that we are currently doing or have recently done. In this picture, though, I want to acknowledge our comrade, T. Peter. He was the leader of the organization, the Small-Scale Fisher Organization in India. But regretfully, because of COVID, he passed. He passed away due to some complication developed from COVID. So this is one of our leaders. We give special recognition and acknowledgement to. He hosted us in Delhi. So 20 years after the WFFP was formed, he hosted us in Delhi, and so it's sad, and we pay tribute to him. And so what I have on this page, some work being done in Asia. We have what we call the blue economy, and our members, there are a lot of stories and narratives about perhaps how great and big and good the blue economy could be for all. And so we had six member countries in Asia conducting a Blue Economy Tribunal. So this started last year, well, previous to that, but the tribunals itself, the research and the study started maybe in 2018. And what they did was that they studied about 50 communities, and they brought this now to a tribunal this year. And the results from this tribunal were, I want to give you some examples. For example, in Sri Lanka, 600,000 people in Sri Lanka will be affected by one single port development project. And then in Bangladesh, there's a large chunk of an island that will be turned into a special economic zone. And this alone will affect 3.2 million people. Then in Thailand, the Grand Thai Canal connecting the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. This will create havoc to both nature and millions of people in China. Indonesia, the new omnibus law that was in 2020, this could lead to displacement of 8 million fisher households. And this is to provide space for new industries and existing industries such as tourism and other in other development. And then in India, they have this one specific port project. It will affect 10,000 fisherwomen. And this project is just a little fraction of the projects they have under what is called a Blue Revolution project from the government of India. So these, the results from the jury, it was shocking and it created alarm for our membership because they now have evidence and they have documentation to show how our members are being displaced under certain situations created by the blue economy. So what we are doing to respond and give a positive narrative for small scale fishers, first, we conduct research study so that when we speak, we can come with facts. So small scale fishers, they remain excluded from decisions affecting their lives and territories. So our lives are put aside sometimes to foster the development of other industries. And so some of our communities, when our members are protesting and voicing their concerns, sometimes they are met with militarization and they are repressed. When they are exercising their traditional practices and their human rights, they are pushed back. And this is because of some corporate organization being greedy and having a capitalist approach and developmental projects. And we also look at gender equality, and it's worsening, and the climate crisis is definitely deepening. So what we hear as an organization and a movement, a social movement of small scale fishers, we recognize that we are the majority. And together, we can shape the future of small scale fishers to protect and unprotect our nature. So I don't have a very long presentation. I am just highlighting some work that we are doing that aligns with our topic of presenting new positive narratives and changing the narrative and the outlook of how fisher folks are perceived. I want to draw some attention to some work being done by the CNFO. If you know me, you know that I am from the Caribbean and I represent the Caribbean region. We have 17 member states. So countries like Jamaica, Belize, Haiti, Trinidad and Tobago, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, all of those come under an umbrella organization of which I represent. And what we were trying to do last year, well, this one is specific to last year, I'm giving recent stories. We did a social media campaign, but this was in collaboration with partners. We had the University of the West Indies, CERMES, working with us to help and push out positive narratives. And this was an excellent look for us. So we had 44 fisherfolk influencers, and they came on every Wednesday. We did this for 6 months. Every Wednesday we featured a strong, talented, skillful fisherwoman. And on Fridays, we would feature and give acknowledgement and praise and a story about a fisherman. And we had other positive narratives that we were pushing. So we used social media a lot, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, to try and present some of these new narratives that we are developing in small scale fishing communities. And so I have some faces here One lady there is the past chair of the CNFO and the current chair, Mr. Adrian LaRoda, and there's a man there with a fish, and he's from Belize. He was Fisher of the Year last year. So this campaign raised awareness, definitely. Our Facebook was not active. If we had 100 followers at the end of this campaign, maybe we had 300. Everything improved in terms of percentage by 200-300%. People were starting to see our stories. We did newsletters. People were eager to hear what news we have now from the CNFO, what's coming. It started to build interest, and our stories and narratives were being placed more assertively and aggressively in the social media space. I'm just giving more work. I know this is an opening speech and I don't have a lot of time, but I'm not too far. I'm soon going to conclude, but what we have done, and COVID, it created this opportunity for us last year at WFFP. We are so far apart all over the Caribbean Sea, the Indian Ocean, and sometimes it's difficult to connect due to language barriers, location, and everything else but last year we had to figure a way to continue our work even under hard times, or difficult, different, I will say, different times. And I'm sure it could have been more than 15 webinars, but we hosted in the year 2020 at least 15 webinars for our membership. And each webinar, our members were very interested. They came on to the sessions, and we had from 50 to 150 participants at each session. And we had to have languages sometimes, depending on how large and big, interpretation of over 10 languages. It got so complex, but it worked. It worked out. We had, I would say, professional interpretation people that worked behind the scenes to make that possible. But yes, so we gathered our members, and this is for them to engage with each other, exchange ideas, give life to the WFFP, inform us of the direction that we need to go, and especially regarding the narrative, what narratives we want out there in the public spaces. And so in these sessions, we met, and I have a picture here. This was the very last one, and this was this year. We were discussing a very important topic and how the WFFP should engage in the, I would say it was on the UNFSS, the Food System Summit. So we met just on that topic to understand the narratives that were outside presented to the public domain and how we fit into that, and what narratives we as Fisher Folk organizations want to present. And so our membership came up with ideas of how they want to engage in such a summit or a system or a process. And those were the types of things we were doing last year. I mean, we always should be doing it, but it was so intense last year. Our members appreciated the effort that we made to engage them in this light. So we had topics ranging from ocean grabbing, food sovereignty, inland fisheries, women and youth assembly, and so on. And yes, so that's the type of work we have been doing, and this capacity building, information sharing, and this education that have been going on. It is, the bottom line is at this topic, it is for us to present ourselves to the highest regards with upliftment, and any negative or any connotation that is not presented positively, for us to show the other side, for the public to see the other side of the coin. In Belize, we have a saying. So we have dialect in Belize, but it goes maybe in English, and maybe you know the saying, fisherman never say if fish stink, meaning that if you are directing how this narrative will go, you would not criticize yourself. You would only show the positive. And so that is what we are, the stage that we are at. We have been doing this forever, but it's time now to push back, push out these stories from small scale organization. I am from Belize, so I think this might be maybe my last slide. And I just have a small example here. Depending on where you are, depending on the type of illness, will determine how detrimental or not it is. So I'm not here to give you any information on that. I'm just presenting what is happening in my country. So we have a ban, a gillnet ban that got enacted in November of last year, 2020. And the public, even people in my family, come and say that is a good thing. I have very close family, like living in my house, thinking that that's a good thing, because the only image, the only story they are hearing is a one-sided story, a propaganda that is on the TV all day. When I say all day, you turn on the news, there is a 5 minutes or 3 minutes clip on why we should ban gillnet. And these are coming from maybe some environmental groups, some people a lot of people in the tourism industry, and they have called some fisher folk to supporting this idea. And what the Belize Fishermen Cooperative Association is doing is presenting another side to the story, explaining to the Belizean public it is not as bad as being presented, and the fisher folk doing this activity are not criminals as being portrayed. So they're actually taking the government and I guess Oceana to court on this issue, because even though a ban is not illegal, the process to arriving at that ban, the process of not adequately ensuring that those people that use the gillnet were satisfied and comfortably transitioned into a new gear or fishing activity. None of those elements were in place when the ban took place. So I'm saying you have to ensure that the people are properly transitioned before you implement such a harsh thing like a ban. So they did it reverse. They did the ban, and now they are trying to work with people to see how they can effectively have them continue fishing. But then that is the reverse. Now the people, they had a sudden closure of a livelihood. So fishing is not just about making money, especially in Belize. We have indigenous communities like the Garifuna people who use fishing as a way of life. Fishing with gillnet has been done from time immemorial, from in the Bible, and these are part of your natural life. It is a part of who you are. So when you do something like that, it affects us tremendously. And I know that because I have a 17-year-old son. If you see in my bio, I have 2 children, and that is my work. When you talk about work, I talk about my motherhood first before I speak about anything. And my son, his dad is a fisher, the granddad is a fisher. And I don't know, it's something that you're born with, because from the day he was born, that is all he wants to do, go on a boat and go fishing. And now I'm pushing him not to divert his dream, but to ensure that he has an education. But when you go to school, there is no such school as learning to fish, except the skill that he learns from his dad. So the narrative also in the school system is not set up for us to appreciate and love the art and the work and the skill of fishing. So now he just registered for classes, and the closest thing that looked familiar to being on a boat or fishing was the tourism. So he registered at the university. He's 17, so it's fresh level in tourism. Whatever he wishes to do is his desire, whatever. But my point is, this system is set up that we do not uplift and we do not give recognition to this very important, and we know how FAO gives value to fishing as a nutritious meal. The tourism sector said, no, we can go and look at that fish, and it can bring that one fish can bring $1 million to us, but we cannot undermine the value of nutrition and how important it is to have a nutritious diet, and fish is one of the most important meal that we can eat. The nutrients that come from fish, how it's good for our immune system. It probably is helping us in the fight against COVID. Some of us, it strengthens us. So we know the positive of the narratives that we should be sending on our behalf, but nobody can do that except us small scale fishers. We are the one who needs to take charge and send the positive new messages to the global world and to our public. I am going to conclude. I have 2 points and I will just read what I have here. But if you look at the pictures, some of our slogans: assert our rights, restore our dignity. And we have a lot of our women now being very actively engaged and pushing the agenda of the small scale fishers and pushing our narratives into the public space, because our voices need to be heard. It must be heard. The coin needs to be flipped, and you need to hear the other side of that story, how fishing is a way of life and the importance of being a fisher folk in the world. So we are the majority, and we should share this narrative, creating new positive narrative, asserting our rights and protecting nature. Currently, the position we are at here now in the WFFP organization, we need to take evaluation, we need to take stock of all we have done, all we have said, because certainly some of our own same languages, it have been co-opted, and we need to continue building up ourselves and building up new positive narratives. And this is in support of the people we work for, the people we represent, the small scale fishers of the world. So I thank you so much, Kate. It was very wavy if the WFFP would participate, but I knew this was a very important topic, and you and your organization personally accommodated us to be here as best as you can. So we are here and we're grateful and thankful. Bye. I hope I didn't overdo.
Thank you, Nadine. That had some really important insights. It's so great to hear about the WFFP's work and even your own personal story about your son, and really reinforcing the value of the sector as a really dignified and important profession. And I really also like you talking about how we kind of have to come together and rally behind the fishers and the fish workers and lift up their narratives. So that's actually a really nice segue into our next presenter, which is Dr. Dihia Belhabib. She's the principal investigator at EcoTrust Canada, and she recently published a paper about decolonizing science and advocacy work to drive real change, which had some really deep and important insights. Maybe some of you saw it. She'll also be talking to us on this topic and also about minding one's privilege. So I'm pleased to hand the floor over to Dr. Dihia today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to see you here. So the initial title for this presentation was something around the lines of decolonizing science. And I wanted to make it really more towards the actual theme of the day, which is small-scale fisheries and moving beyond the colonial narrative. So I chose the word privilege here because I don't know how many of you have watched the recent documentary, whose name I'm not going to mention, but it was absolutely frustrating for me to watch. It was emanating from a space of privilege and white saviorism. And I did not like it since the beginning, but I forced myself to watch it because I thought it will get maybe better, and it did not, and I was fairly disappointed about it. So as Nadine has mentioned, small-scale fisheries are quite important. So they are, they provide food, livelihoods, income, but they do have some, and I don't like the word intangible, but they do have some intangible values associated with them as well that we do not tend to discuss that much in scientific, you know, and even documentaries and these kind of contexts. So a sense of belonging, you know, cultural values. She mentioned her son, you know, wanting to do that, dreaming and wanting to follow through his family's tradition. You know, it provides social cohesion and spiritual values among so other many things. It is not only about fishing for food or fishing for livelihoods or fishing for income. However, there's a huge problem associated with this colonial narrative, is that small-scale fisheries are often put in the same basket, in the same spaces than the industrial large-scale sectors. And I do know that I should not be stereotyping the industrial sector as all bad. However, the fact that it's put together, the small-scale sector is put together with the industrial sector by organizations such as the FAO when they collect their data. In fact, the process of collecting data does not necessarily allow for a separation between the two. And then you arrive on these international policy tables and you find yourself discussing, for example, subsidy disciplines. So how can we remove subsidies from both the small scale and the large scale sector? And I do remember one specific anecdote there where I did have an argument with a delegate from the EU, or basically an ambassador at the World Trade Organization, where I was arguing that we should start thinking about special and differential treatment for the small scale sector, meaning we should not take away their subsidies because they need those. At this point in time, they need those. And he said we should not start making exceptions. And I remember telling him maybe the exception we should make then should be your vessels from the EU fishing in West African waters that should go. And let's see how they're performing. I'm quite sure that we perform quite all right without any subsidies. So we are in a space right now where we think only about the status quo. You know, the gillnets that Nadine had mentioned, for example, you know, what if we think about that as the gillnets were used for, you know, many decades, years, hundreds of years. What happened after that was the industrialization of the fishing sector. That is what changed. Those gill nets were always there, and I'm going to get to that as well. So there is an imbalance of power that is not captured with these policy tables or our narratives as researchers and scientists and advocacy efforts. There is also an economic power imbalance as well. We do know that 1% of the fleets around the world are actually industrial, but they catch most of the fish. And 25% is caught by those small scale sector, which constitute, you know, nearly 19 small scale and coastal sectors, which constitute nearly 99% of the fishing effort. So there are huge imbalances there, but it doesn't stop there. It's also about how we portray the solutions, you know, that we hear more and more often, like stop eating fish, it's going to save the ocean. And I tag this as the greatest colonial quotes of all times. You know, we heard this in the recent documentary. We also hear something innocent, such as aquaculture is the solution. And I give a lot of power to words because that is what we're talking about today. These narratives that we need to decolonize. And then obviously the one, and there are a lot of people that are gonna, you know, maybe contest me and maybe on YouTube because I've seen the audience. And I'm quite sure that a lot of people would agree with me on this. State-run marine protected areas, you know, that objective of reaching 30% of protection of, you know, at least coastal spaces or EEZs in the world by 2030. That objective to me sounds very colonial. Why? Because it stems from a space where a country like Canada, for example, takes a long time to consult with communities through the map to get into where to place a marine protected area, how to place it. It takes a long time consulting with indigenous people, with coastal communities, settler coastal communities, etc. Imagine a country that does not have the capacity to do so. Imagine a bureaucratic or a dictatorial country. How would that show? That will illustrate itself. These 30% prestigious, amazing state-run marine protected areas will manifest themselves by top-down approaches through which coastal communities are not consulted. They are not included in the process. And when that happens, it tends to exclude them, as Nadine had mentioned again, from their, you know, adjacent waters. They lose agency, they lose the the ability to fish, they lose the ability to connect with the ocean, but also they are criminalized through two processes. Either they become fishermen, illegal fishermen, so they're criminalized because they have no longer legal access, but they will still fish because they have no choice, or they will find an alternative form of livelihood. And in many cases, examples include drug trafficking. And again, they end up being criminalized a second time. So one thing that we have to again remember is that fishing has been around for hundreds of thousands of years. It developed with our ancestors during the Paleolithic period, some 20 to 40,000 years ago. Fish farming, traditional fish farming forms have begun later on in the Middle Ages, but industrial fishing has been developed in Europe and has been industrialized in Europe. So they had their fair share of development. And today, when we talk about development narratives, not only around small scale fisheries, but in general, we have to give the space without that narrative of lessons learned. We have to give the space for solutions other than the mainstream ones that are presented that I just talked to you about. So let's get real. Small scale fishing is the solution. It existed for thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. So this frenzy towards new solutions such as aquaculture, for example, I mean, how much consulting when we read in a scientific paper, for example, that this is aquaculture is the new solution, how much consulting with coastal communities has been done to get to that solution? I mean, doesn't that solution ignore an elephant in the room, or taking it more like the status quo? If things are all equal, this is aquaculture and this is how it's going to save the world's oceans. Which type of aquaculture? Because there are sustainable types of aquaculture, but mostly right now it is not sustainable. We are not there yet. But maybe it is because we cannot disassociate these two spaces together that I talked to you about, the industrial and the small scale. We are not providing the small scale narrative enough strength and power to be able to understand that they might, after all, because they are selective, because they've been around for a long time, longer time, because they do not take a lot of fish as opposed to the other type of sector, maybe it is the solution and the nature of how it evolves around these communities. So we are so embracing of doomy and gloomy narratives, and I think that it should change so that we stop devilifying fishermen. There's also the notion that I call neocolonialist conservation approaches, which disregard coastal communities' sense of agency over adjacent waters. So when you come in with a big project for a marine protected area, not necessarily considering those communities, we realize right now that we're criminalizing the poor, both through those processes that I mentioned, earlier. We're using exclusionary conservation. So again, coming in with approaches like, taking away or banning gill nets that have been used for, hundreds of years, or creating a marine protected area that is non-inclusive, or this concept of the blue economy that assumes, for example, that ecotourism. This is just one example, and it might be the solution in some contexts, but let's not ignore that there have been communities there, there are communities there, and in some of these communities, the owners of those resorts that operate ecotourism end up being cartels that have forced small-scale fishermen out of their adjacent waters again. Then we end up with militarized surveillance, and the consequences of that are quite doomy, to be honest. There is another thing that I have to mention here, which we love so much, which are lessons learned, which we use in management, in the fisheries management context and conservation. Lessons learned are only great when they are transferred from similar contexts. We cannot transfer lessons, some lessons at least, cannot be transferred from the Canadian, say, cod fishery collapse, saying we should have had ITQs and a wealth-based approach, and taking that same context or the same lesson to Liberia by an organization such as the World Bank and saying, let's have ITQs in Liberia. I mean, let's be real there. So in summary for this particular slide, neocolonialist conservation has come as a sweeping wave for the small-scale sector. And many discourses aiming at inclusion have actually become a furthering point for neocolonial conservation. Inclusion of, implies stakeholders and processes and so many other things. But while the implementers often remain very limited to a certain demographic group, white men, I wouldn't go towards more of that, controversy. The colonial process of conservation has been disguised, and diversity become a branding statement. As much as we say, oh, if you have, for example, the words small scale fisheries in your funding proposal, you have more chances right now to be funded, not because that project is meaningful, but it's because it has those words in it. It's basically those diversity statements that we love so much, or it's basically like saying, I'm not a racist, I have Black friends. I'm not Islamophobic, I have Muslim friends, etc., etc. So you will have more chances to be funded if you don't wear the hijab. You will have more chances to be funded if you are from a mainstream organization that sometimes actually perpetuates the same neo-colonial approaches to conservation and to the management of small-scale fisheries. Some things that we see a lot is a narrative that fishers are emptying the oceans. They are evil, driving such recommendations that I spoke about earlier. Fishermen are in fact drawn more and more into poverty and then criminalized after they choose other ways of living. My experience in decolonizing the narrative had to do with a fisherman in Algeria. The day that he told me they took all the fish away from me, pointing to a big trawler near the coast, actually very close to shore. I think from that day on, I suffered from maybe what I call a frequency illusion or a Beider-Meinhof phenomenon, where you see the same thing over and over again. And in my case, I see that narrative of like, they took all the fish away from me over and over again. And I'm just wondering whether it's actually a frequency illusion or it's actually a fact. So I'm stuck there at the moment. I'm stuck there trying to figure that out. We have seen a lot of devilification of fishermen, driving narratives, negative narratives towards them and towards their communities while they're just trying to make a living. They're just trying to remain in cohesive communities. They're just trying to perpetuate their traditions, and so many other intangible and tangible values. We have seen fishermen drawn to poverty over and over again. And I'm just wondering at this point in time how prestigious really it is. When you see those articles in the media of fishermen being caught with, let's say, 5 kilos or 10 kilos or 20 kilos of narcotics on their boats, and like these proud Coast Guard, like standing there in the pictures with all those fishermen, their hands tied to their backs, exposed as if they were criminals. But in fact, they may not even have had the choice at that point. And some things that we miss in these narratives are more, have to do more like with more positivity, thriving non-colonized communities, stewards of the sea that have shut down, for example, government buildings to protect the fishery. I'm talking about the Healthsick community here in Canada that had decided, after telling the government that they should not be allowing a commercial fishery for the herring, the government had said, no, we're allowing it. The herring stock is doing well. The Healthsick community said, the Healthsick Nations, it's an indigenous community here. They said, no, we have our guardians out in the water and we do know that the stock is not doing great. So please don't allow for commercial fishing. And the government refused. So they took their matters in their hands. They went out at sea. They escorted the vessels out of their territorial waters and then their territory. And then they had the government building shut down in protest until the fishery was effectively closed. We also have the example of other stewards on the east coast of Canada right before the collapse of the cod fishery, when they actually alerted the government that something was wrong, because they knew better than any government scientist or any academic at the time. They said the cod fishery is not doing great. There is something bad about it. There's something going on. Please shut it down. The government refused, and we all know now what happened. It's one of the worst cases of fisheries collapses the world has known, and it's the cod fisheries collapse in Canada. There are also those positive narratives towards more traditional context of, traditional fishing communities, like having the deities of the sea and the accountability that comes with that one should be relying on the sea, but at the same time not offending those deities by over exploiting, using, illegal practices, etc., and respecting what the sea has to offer to us. So my call to action today is to really stop importing solutions and start listening to existing ones, which are quite obvious to me. How about we start talking about, the successes and the wins? This is the positive narratives that we have to start talking about, so that those lessons learned, quote unquote, could be transferred in similar contexts from one place to another if another place needs it. We need science to be a bit less headliney and title-driven and glamour-driven and more pragmatic towards including these positive narratives, even though they are not as sexy as the doom and gloom that we see and we promote as much. And finally, for academics around the room, I really would call for researchers to be trained beyond the ivory tower, to forget a little bit about being on a high horse that's going to save these communities and more going towards learning from these communities. And that would be my last presentation point for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dahlia. That was fantastic and so great to hear your insights on really we need to stop looking for those big, shiny, flashy solutions and really look to existing strengths and the successes of the communities, and really recognizing and lifting those up. So that's some really important reminders for us all there. So our next speaker was going to be Dawda Sane from the African Confederation of Professional Organisations of Artisanal Fisheries, also known as CALPA. He unfortunately couldn't join us today, so we won't be having his presentation. So now we'll move on to, I just want to share a short video before we start our panel discussion. We've been talking a lot about tapping into and recognising and listening to the voices of the fishers and the fish workers out there. So I just want to share a quick video of a fisherman talking about his experience.
আমি জাফর আলম কক্সবাজার জেলার উপজেলার একজন ক্ষুদ্র মৎস্যজীবী। আর আজ জীবনের গল্প সমস্যা সম্ভাবনা পত্রিকায় উঠে না। আর আজ জীবনের বক্তব্য প্রকাশ করা হয় না। সরকারি বা এনজিও সমস্যা কাজের সময় আমার সাথে যোগাযোগ করে। আমরা তাদেরকে সব তথ্য দিয়ে সহযোগিতা করি। যেমন আমাদের এখানে ইকোবিশ বিকল্প যোগাযোগ করে আমরা সহযোগিতা করি। আমাদের জীবনে অনেক গুরুত্বপূর্ণ তথ্য আছে, যেমন আমরা সাগরে এমন ঝুঁকি নিয়ে মাছ ধরি। বন্ধের সময় আমরা অনেক কষ্ট থাকি। করোনার সময় জেলেরা অনেক কষ্টে আছে। যেসব আমরা তথ্য পাই আমরা সবাই মেনে চলি। সাগরে মাছ রক্ষায় আমরা সরকারকে সহযোগিতা করি।
That's just a short reminder and giving us insight into the perspective of the fishers that are really living this reality of small-scale fisheries day in and day out. And you heard there how he says fishers' voices aren't being published in the newspaper. And I think it's important for those of us that do have spheres of influence that we really do help to amplify those voices. So now that brings us to the panel discussion of today's webinar, and we've got 4 excellent speakers who will be providing some insights. We've got Mohammed Arju, who's the director of Sagar Siba. We have Dr. Prateep Nayak, the project director of Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership. Libby Drew, the founder of On Our Radar, and also her colleague, Estina Taylor, the community engagement lead of On Our Radar. So I just want to direct the first question to Arju. Just panelists, turn on your cameras and microphones as I introduce you, and please keep your responses short. I know you've got lots of exciting, insightful things to say, but we do have limited time. So Arju, you work in small-scale fisheries in South Asia. So can you share an example of a dominant narrative around small-scale fisheries in South Asia and how it's supporting or impacting fishers, fish workers and communities? And along with this, how can we amplify or shift this narrative?
Thank you, Kate. I think there are few, but the one I would like to share today is that not just throughout South Asia, I think in most places in the tropical coastal oceans, we have a number of narratives, but those are mostly centered around artisanal and subsistence fishings, small-scale fisheries impact or the interfaces of small scale fisheries with conservation of aquatic megafauna, conservation of species of conservation interest, such as sharks, rays, or whales, and other megafauna, photogenic species, also important species, of course. So what happens if you notice, as Dahia was talking about the colonial narratives around the small scale fisheries, it's also related to that, I think. Many a times we see that rather than doing more research or doing the hard work of reaching out to the fishers, or even trying to get the real picture from the ground, from the fishing grounds, from the coastal communities. We see particularly two groups of stakeholders. One of them are mainstream media houses, and also a number of, I think, some scientists and even practitioners also. They present the whole thing, the interfaces between wildlife and small scale fisheries, aquatic wildlife and small scale fisheries, in a way that's probably this is something that inherently dangerous. Artisanal fishing of subsistence fishing is inherently dangerous for wildlife. And in the process, what happens, the small scale fishers, artisanal fishers, subsistence fishers, they assess they don't have, they're marginalized. They don't have, in most of the cases, effective participation in the any decision-making process related to their interests. And when you add this more vilification to that, it I think it harms our efforts in two ways. One, it alienates the fisher from any kind of engagement to conservation, even in small scale fisheries or wildlife. And the second thing that happens, the stakeholders, the media houses, the journalists, the scientists, they don't realize that they have more to do. And I think this is something we can overcome with some, not just some real work with the small scale fishers, but also realizing that you have access to small scale fishing boats, particularly in South Asia. You have access to the processing centers. You have access to any gill netters, for example, in Bay of Bengal. You can see in your eyes any interaction with wildlife. But naturally, all the researchers who have publications, all the journalists who are publishing in mainstream media, you don't have access to industrial fishing fleet. So it's not always that you get to compare the impact and interfaces, interaction with fisheries, industrial fisheries and small scale fisheries, interaction with wildlife. This is one thing. And the second thing is, I think we need to also, it's not just about outward communication about small scale fisheries to other stakeholders or the general audience, but also intergenerational communication. For example, in Bay of Bengal, you have a large number of, a great extent of ecologically good practices practiced by traditional artisanal fishers. They go to a great extent to release any entangled bycatch, any entangled sea turtles or other species, and they respect that. But this is not something that is communicated, for example, with new fishers who have internally migrated to the coastal areas due to lack of good job opportunity inland. So yes, I think I will summarize that the interaction, the interfaces between wildlife conservation in aquatic spaces and small scale fisheries is something oftentimes exaggerated, and also the fishers are vilified. And I think we can overcome this by facilitating this intergenerational communication between a group of fishers and also different type of fishers who come to fishing. And second thing is not just if you, for example, if you have a research about impact of gill nets on a certain species of conservation interest, and this is your sampling is very limited, you have a lots of limitation in the study, but you are making very oversimplified statement as a journalist. You should not do that. Sorry, as a scientist. Yeah, I think that will be all to answer this question. Thank you.
Thanks, Arju. That's some great insights there. I want to next invite Libby to answer a question. So really, the most remote and marginalised groups hold a wealth of insight into the challenges facing small-scale fisheries. So Libby, can you talk about the untapped power of unheard voices and why the strength of their stories is diluted when outsiders speak on their behalf?
Yes, thank you, Kate. Well, I'm sure I speak for everyone when we understand that the right to speak is a fundamental right underpinning democracy, safeguarding citizen engagement. And whilst that right must be protected and advocated for, I've seen a really more exciting trend emerge over 10 years of working on community journalism. And that is the call to action that those living through the most complex livelihood chains, the social, cultural, economic crises and challenges, not only have a right to speak, but fundamentally have insight that is inherently valuable to society. And that lived experience is an essential component to balance out our learned experience that we hold within our journalistic and research communities. Yet for so long we've relied on that professional knowledge gathering, that observation, those held conversations of data gathering, which are all such valuable methodologies. But communities just must wait for the arrival of those research initiatives. They must respond to predefined question sets, often in a language other than their mother tongue, and worked timeframes allocated by funders and institutions rather than speaking at their own pace at the moment that matters to them. And of course, they may never get to see the outcome of their participation or the impact it may have. And essentially, this power imbalance is clearly detrimental to the communities themselves, but is detrimental to all of us, to our social understanding. And to base our knowledge and therefore our solutions and policies and practices on the basis of simply professional research and evaluation is just missing a crucial swathe of the insight held. And so lived experience forms that other side of learnt experience, and whether that's through oral history, citizen reporting, collective community filmmaking, or any other means that we have to our disposal as citizens, it is untapped, valuable information. And the means to share that, therefore, and listen to that, stops being a moral rights-based approach and moves to a more pragmatic asset-based approach where communities are valued because of their experiences and not simply invited as part of an inclusive mechanism, but are needed and are wanted and are asked because of their value to society. And just a quick point, we recognise that there's a barrage of challenges when it comes to speaking and being heard. That's not just a given, particularly for women and girls. And at Radar, we have a framework called the 5 Cs, which we've co-produced with communities over the last decade. And that's ranged from every country that we've worked in, every ethnicity and gender and age have said the same thing, that they struggle with a lack of connectivity, both digital, political and social connections. But they also lack confidence in themselves, conviction that things will actually change in the system. They often lack capacity, whether that's knowledge, time, resources, and critically, they often lack the craft for their insight to reach the audiences where they most matter, to be produced in that kind of format that policymakers or platforms or audiences require. But to overcome them, we just don't need people who are going to speak on their behalf or represent or mediate or paraphrase. So we need to switch from being journalists and researchers to being bridge builders, connectors, networkers, who are using our research and journalistic connections to amplify those voices by ensuring that they get seen by the audiences that matter, using those social, digital and political connections, and critically feeding that impact back to those communities so they can stay in control of those narratives.
Yeah, thank you. I really like that you've reinforced that we really have to engage with them in a really deep and meaningful way, not just a box ticking exercise, but also recognise that, you know, we all have different spheres and networks, and we need to use those to amplify the voices of those who aren't being heard that really should be heard. So I like that you're talking about connecting that bridge. Thank you, Libby. Prateep, you're the project director of the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnerships. Can you talk about why new positive narratives on small scale fisheries are so important? And can you illustrate with an example?
Thank you, Kate, for the invitation. And it's wonderful to be with a panel and hearing all those stories from around the world. I think positive narratives are necessary at this point in time because of multiple reasons. The first reason is we have been witnessing that it is somebody's story and somebody else has been in a dominant role to say that story. So we need to be aware that, whose narratives and who is expressing them, who is speaking for whom. I think the positive narrative that we are aiming today should include the storyteller needs to be telling their stories, and the narratives should be the narratives of the people that are narrating them. And we need to change that from the previous practice of somebody else telling somebody else's story. Positive narratives are necessary because things within and around small-scale fisheries have changed drastically. So there are probably need for new narratives to be, framed and then be told and shared with everybody. Communities around the world are seeing rapid change, change that they had never thought about happening in their lives and in their fisheries. So those stories need to address the changes that are taking place. We need positive stories because clearly the existing narratives may not have worked perfectly and clearly in many domains relating to small-scale fisheries they have not worked. So we need new narratives to kind of replace or substantiate the existing narrative so that we can tell the story in a more stronger, in a more powerful way. We need new narratives because we want the fisher people and the new generations of fishers to stay engaged and be interested and find meaning in the small-scale fisheries sector. And I say this in view of what is happening in terms of depopulation and people, large-scale migration and new generations of fishers not finding a way of life within the existing fisheries. So we need new narratives to attract them, to tell them that there is still probably a way of life within the fisheries itself. But at the same time, I'm also kind of very aware of the fact that why we are talking about positive narratives. Are we trying to tell positive narratives to hide the not so positive or negative narratives? I would tend to believe that that is not the case. I think the positive narratives needs to be used as a metaphor for telling all sorts of narratives, because negative narratives and positive narratives both can be very powerful in influencing positive change and transformation within small-scale fisheries. So, I would like kind of to bring this to the discussion today, that in the name of positive narratives, we should not forget about not so positive narratives, because people's lives are not, influenced by positivities always. There are negatives, there are adverse impacts in people's life that needs to be captured, and narratives needs to be holistic in that way that they capture both negative and the positive. So positive narratives as a metaphor. To conclude, the example that I would give is, Kate, what you said, my role as a member of the B2B Vulnerability to Viability Global Network, which is about more than 100 organizations, institutions, and people in government, policy, academia, NGO, and communities that have come together to tell a new narrative. The new narrative is that small-scale fisheries have often been talked about, for their vulnerabilities. But if it was only vulnerabilities, then many of these small-scale fisheries would have perished by now. The fact that they have been surviving, struggling, and finding ways to kind of make life and livelihoods possible tells us that there is something very positive. There is something very powerful. There is something that has kept them going until today. So the new narrative that we have created through vulnerability to viability, global partnership on small-scale fisheries is that not to talk about vulnerability and viability or sustainability or resilience separately, but to talk about vulnerability to viability, to show that it is always possible to transition from vulnerability to viability given certain conditions are met. And in our pursuit, we're trying to find out those strengths within small-scale fisheries and the partners that work with them to make this transition possible. And that's the new narrative I believe strongly, and I'm working on with many of my friends, colleagues, and partners around the world through the B2B Global Partnership on Small-Scale Fisheries. Thank you.
Thank you, Prateek. And that's certainly really important work to make that link between the progress and the successes, and that links back with what Dee here was saying, definitely. I'd now like to invite Athena, who's a colleague of Libby's on our radar, to talk with us about international community networks and some of the challenges and opportunities of those remote networks.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here, and I have learned so much from each and every one of you. So about the challenges. So we are talking about community-led solutions, and we're talking about the community. And I work with the community, and I listen to them. Because most times when we say we work with the communities, it's about telling them what to do, coming up with solutions and everything. Well, my role is to listen to the communities and take all of their concerns. As Libby was saying, that it's about giving voice to the people, not only allowing them to talk, but they are the ones who are supposed to talk about what's affecting them. And let me talk about some of the challenges. I do community engagement for close to over 7 countries. And from Sierra Leone, where I'm coming from, you would see there are lots of challenges. So the first issue that I want to raise is the Black Johnson issue in my country, Sierra Leone. As it stands now, the Sierra Leone government is selling 250 acres of land or rainforest to a construction company or Chinese fish mill. And they're going to be producing things for pigs in China and all. So these are challenges, and the communities, the challenges that they're facing, they want more land to start like aquaculture. They want their voices to be heard, because they feel like whenever they talk about their challenges, they criminalizes them and they make them feel like the bad people. And whenever they start up like campaigns or they start up like things, they want to talk about their communities and how they can harness all of the good things. People don't listen to them. And the biggest issue is economic issue. They don't have the money, they don't have the finances to finance their small fishing businesses. And most of them, they feed their families. And if they can't, what can I say? If they can't get the money that they need, if they can't get the resources from the fishing sector, from these small fishing network, if they can't get it, they would not be able to feed their families. They would not be able to survive. And most likely, you would see that their people are taking away their livelihood from them, and their challenges are enormous, like the COVID-19 pandemic. Most of them, they're struggling to even sell in the market because of restrictions. They are struggling to even go out and get the fish because of climate change issues. So these are challenges, and they're calling on people that they want community led solutions. Just as Dihir said, that we should start listening to people. start listening to the communities rather than taking solutions, exporting solutions into these communities. They want to look at community-led solutions. They want to come up with their own issues. Like, for instance, in the Black Johnson area, if that particular place, 250 acres of land is given to the Chinese company, they would lose livelihood. Their families would be displaced, because that entire area is going to be given to that factory. So these are some of the challenges that people face. And in Africa, in all of the network, the Outfish networks and the network that we are coordinating, these are the challenges. They want to be, they want digital literacy to be able to empower themselves, to be able to capacitate themselves so that they can be able to move with the trends, because the challenges are tied to the opportunities, I can see. Because if all of the lands are taken away from them, they don't have opportunities to start their own fish ponds, to start breeding different kinds of fish or different kinds of aqua products. They would not have the opportunity to do that if these lands are taken away from them. And if there are no opportunities to empower them, opportunities to make them stronger. And for the women that I deal with, they are faced with gender equality issues. So in the places where their community, their fishing communities, they don't have the voice to talk. And in these communities, when they are going out, they are always the ones who go out and buy the fish. But they're asking the questions, why not be the ones who own the boats, who sell these fish, who have factories for themselves, and help other women? Because you would see that if big companies are coming into our countries and taking all of these big acres and taking all of these rainforests and all of these places where people catch fish, if they're taking these away from them, they are not helping the community. But if women or people or fisher people, they are given the power, they are empowered. These people, they will be able to empower other people in their communities. So the challenges, I will say again, are tied to the opportunities. So when we address the challenges, there will be more opportunities for the communities, the network, the local networks, to be able to empower themselves and women who are struggling to take care of their families.
Thank you. Yeah, I really like that point about linking the challenges and the opportunities together, and really just getting in there and listening and respecting their needs. That's so important. Thank you. So we're getting towards the end of the session. So I do still have lots more questions for the panelists, but right now I think we'll throw to a question that we've received from the audience, and perhaps Nadine might like to take a first go at this one, which is really how do we change the perception of certain fishers and bring about a ban on illegal nets and fishing gear? The question specifically relating to regions where there's transboundary issues of sharing resources. So they've highlighted the Sundarbans in India and Bangladesh. Nadine, do you want to have a go at that?
I don't know where you're seeing this question. I am trying to see if I understood, but in our region, it's similar, if I understand the question, that we share borders with Guatemala and neighboring countries. And so we have that similar where we have IUU. They come over and they do illegal fishing, and that was the paramount point where they wanted, the propaganda started that we need to ban the gill net because it is not being utilized mostly by the Belizean fishers, but from people from across the border. But the solution to that is we need to do patrolling and we need to implement and enforce the regulations that exist. I don't know if it's a two-part question. All right, I tried to answer what I heard. Yeah.
Did anyone else want to contribute to that? No, that could be enough for now. So I'm just going to invite Libby to tell us a little bit more. Libby, you're the founder of On Our Radar, which is a non-profit communications agency that works to amplify stories for social change. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing with ORFishNet, the African Women Fish Processors and Traders Network, and the methodology you're using to amplify their voices?
Absolutely. So very quickly, because I know we're running out of time. So Radar is made up of a global network of interdisciplinary practitioners. We represent journalists, researchers, community development activists, and also technical developers. And we work right across the world to set up community research and reporter networks, and then bridge those gaps with media professionals, service providers, policymakers, and also summits and events as well as public audiences and social media. So in this work, we're working across 7 African countries with 14 women, so pairs of reporters, who are trained using mobile techniques in order to go deeper into their communities and start an inquiry-based reporting sprint. So we've been working over 6 weeks. Every Tuesday, we set an assignment. That's a guide assignment, simply to try and kind of give some relevance to the reporting, bust that blank page syndrome where people might not know quite how to start. But it's certainly not mandatory, and many of the women are indeed organically going down their own lines of inquiry. But the emphasis is on collectively surfacing the genuine impacts of COVID-19 on fishing communities, particularly women and girls, and to leave that open to whether or not solutions emerge. And that was really important, that we didn't force a solutions-focused inquiry. Sometimes the problems are simply there, and we shouldn't pass the buck essentially to the communities who are experiencing those challenges to solve them. That very much is a collaboration. But what we are doing is saying we're also not looking for a single story. This is a broad inquiry on whether things have inspired community-led solutions, whether things feel really entrenched and difficult, whether it's individual stories or big collective trends. And they're all sharing back these stories and insights to a collective group on WhatsApp, where they can all see across the 7 countries one another's work. That's prompting a lot of cross-border collaboration, sparking almost amazement at the commonalities, and also really making clear some national distinctions. Now, that's all coming through to what's happening at the moment, which is a co-commissioning process where the women involved are upvoting the priority stories. Those will then go forward to an audio or film feature, which will be shared at the upcoming summits and events related to fisheries and food. And the women themselves will be shooting and recording that audio. They are getting advanced training on how to do that clearly. And then we will be supporting them on the edit of that. The wonderful thing about doing it in this way is the women are fully in control of both the story, the agenda, the framing, the narration, and also who they want to see this material, this insight. And then they'll be given support to take that back to their communities, hopefully prompting a call to action. And all of this is happening on mobile phone right in the middle of the lockdown. So if it could be done now, it can be done there's no excuse for doing it in normal times. Thank you.
Thanks, Libby. That sounds like some amazing work that's happening in these communities, and we're getting these stories out there using technology that's become so accessible in so many places. So that's excellent. So I'm going to give the final question to Dr. D here. And someone has asked, could you give a positive example of conservation by small-scale fisheries communities?
Sure. I think the question is great. There are so many examples, obviously, all over the world, all over the planet, that we don't talk enough about. I can talk about the Guardians here by Indigenous communities in Canada. They have a system where people are taught through traditional ways about their fisheries and the ocean and how it's going. Like, not only fisheries, there's forests, etc., but in terms of this particular context, the Guardians are really an amazing context that I really like, because it does drive into social cohesion. It does drive into shaming within communities and accountability towards those communities. There is an example of the Imragan in Mauritania, who have had conservation strategies for hundreds of years. It's in the national park of the Bandarga in Mauritania. Before they shifted to shark fishing, thanks to the introduction of shark fins by international markets, I would say, They have had these strategies where communities were actually fishing, taking roles, taking seasons, if you will, and spaces and places together to fish for millets. There are also the prud'hommes in France who are not necessarily, they're between small scale, they're not large scale, I wouldn't call them large scale, but they're like small scale and coastal. And they have these, again, like conservation through social norms and through social rules that are not necessarily implemented by government, but they have these for, again, like, dozens and dozens of years that have been implemented. And all these are by coastal communities, strategies by coastal communities. Another good example is one that I mentioned about the cod fishery in Canada. Obviously, it's a negative, like it ended up in a negative, in a collapse of a fishery. But the positive fact there that we need not to forget was that fishermen, coastal communities have gone to the government and told them something is wrong. We need to impose a moratorium on the fishery before it collapses. The moratorium was imposed after it collapsed, which is basically too late. But those are really positive examples. And there are, hundreds of others that I would not be able to mention. There are dozens that I know of all around the planet, like in Tanzania, in Madagascar, where people are really taking matters at hand. There's the example of a fisherman in Senegal that single-handedly caught illegal fishing vessels, at the time Chinese, when they were going encroaching into areas where they should not have been. And he caught them because he thought, this is what I'm, what I need to do. He was part of what we call a CLPA in Senegal, and he, which is a community-driven initiative where, people are part of the management plans. It was introduced by the World Bank. It's not necessarily great, but the positive example is one of stewardship, where the fishermen decided to take matters at hand and do the work themselves because the capacity was lacking. These are a few examples that I could mention.
Thank you. That's a really good breadth of examples there. So I hope that's answered the question. Well, that brings us to the end of our webinar today. I would just invite all our panelists and speakers to turn on their cameras just for one final farewell. It's really been great having everyone on this call. It never seems to be enough time. We never get to all the questions. But of course, there's been some really great insights and reminders and reflections here today. So thank you so much, everyone. And I hope you enjoy some other webinars today on World Oceans Day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.